All right, we are picking up at the latter part of Jeremiah, chapter 7, and we'll be getting into chapter 8, excuse me, man. And in our lessons, if you have the lesson material, that's in lesson number 3, and we're picking up here in just a moment from question number 7. So as you open up or as we're looking through this section of Jeremiah, one of the things that we're going to begin to see in more earnest is some of the repetition. We're already seeing some of that already, certainly repeated themes. He's going to be saying the same things over and over. But particularly in today's lesson, hopefully we'll get to a section where he just repeats almost verbatim something that he's already said. One of the interesting things is scholars, and when I say scholars, I mean people who approach this not as committed Christians, not people who are committed to a belief in the trueness and the certainty of God's word, but just like historical critics. They would look at that repetition and say, oh, well, this obviously is something somebody added later because he's just repeating himself. And I thought, yeah, because we never do that. We'll never repeat ourselves. What an absurdity. There's a guy that I like to read a lot from. He has several books on a variety of subjects. And one of the things that you find when you're reading his books is that happens a lot. He repeats himself, quotes himself sometimes throughout the book. And a lot of it's because many of his books, there's like collected articles where he's writing on the same topic, maybe on different occasions. What's really similar to what we got going on with Jeremiah. He's preaching to people and he's preaching on separate occasions. And guess what? They need to hear the same things that they heard the last time he was preaching to them. And so those sorts of repetitions shouldn't throw us. And also, I want to say as we're going through the book and as we're reading, I think that it's appropriate and even valuable sometimes to collect several portions of a book that all have the same theme or repeated words and study them together by way of overview. But I also think that God's word is laid out in the way that it's laid out with purpose. And so as you go through and you think, man, we've really already talked about this. I know. And God doesn't want us to ignore because it's being repeated any more than he wanted the people it was originally written to ignore. If he's saying it over and over again, he wants us to hear it over and over again. And so we need to sort of accept that sort of repetition as emphasis and not just say, well, I can skip over this part. I've already heard that. No, hear it again. As many times as he has to say it, that's how many times we want to hear it. Okay. So picking up there at the end of chapter 7, as we mentioned last time, as we were closing out the class, he tells them that they need to weep and mourn. He tells them that there's this place where, in verse 31, they have built the high places of Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I did not command, and it did not come upon my heart. Some of your translations will say, it did not even come into my mind. It's not even a thing that God could conceive of, he indicates. I think of what Paul says, things that it's not even appropriate to talk about these things. So he says, you've built your high places in Topheth, which means a burning place, or torch or something like that. It had been purchased from this Hinnom and made into this holy place for them. And he says now in verse 32, this place that you've set up as your holy place for sacrificing your own children, it's going to be known as the Valley of Slaughter instead, because that's where they're going to bury people. They're going to run out of other places. They're going to have to bury bodies there. But then as we get into chapter 8, he says the enemies are going to come and they're going to disinter those buried there in those graves. The prophets in particular are mentioned. And it says in verse 2, they will spread them out to the sun, the moon, and all the host of heaven, which they have loved and which they have served. And so as I mentioned on Wednesday as we were closing out, here are the heavenly hosts that they had made into their gods, like so many other nations. And he says, look at the situation, right? You've worshiped them. Now your bones are going to be strode out before them. And what are they doing for you? Not much, but shining the light on your bones. And so it takes their idolatry and just, in every case, whether it's the Valley of Hinnom that it's turning into the place of slaughter, or here where their remains are being laid bare before their gods who are doing nothing to help them. And all of it, he's really, I think, digging in to that notion. And so that's the picture. That's the picture of judgment. This may have been an oddly worded question. Jeff and I had some conversation about it. But Jeff, what's the only relief that they could possibly hope for in the midst of all of this?
Well, this whole section in this recounting yet again of this coming judgment, the thing that popped in my mind is how different this judgment is in comparison to the book of Judges, where you have people that cry out for relief, and then an avenger is provided, and they have something to hope for and to look forward to, and then they have some relief. Here it says, picking up in verse 3, it says, "And death will be chosen rather than life by all the remnant that remains of the single family, and remains in all the places to which I have driven them, declares the Lord of hosts." So they do not have that hope of a avenger coming and relieving them of this. Their hope is they look forward to death.
Yeah. Death is the only escape to look forward to. It's the only means of any sort of peace that God sort of offers here in the picture of this judgment. So it's a bleak picture. That you might say, the answer is there's no relief. But I think he does mean to say here, this is the thing that you'll look forward to. This is the thing that you'll want. And so he doesn't, as Jeff points out, they're used to, and I think we'll see this in other places. They're very used to finally at the end some relief coming. And Jeremiah is repeatedly saying, it's not coming this time. And so stop looking for it. Stop thinking that you're going to be bailed out yet again. We're past that. All right. In spite of that continued message, that repeated message, they refuse to listen and refuse to make any changes. And Brad, what are the comparisons that Jeremiah offers to describe that refusal?
He says in verse 4, "Do men fall and not get up again? Does one turn away and not turn back? Why then is this people Jerusalem turned away in continual unfaithfulness?" Or rather, faithlessness. So the picture seems to be of somebody who falls down and just can't even be bothered to get up. He's just going to wallow in his infidelity and in his baseness. And you keep reading down in verse 7, "Even the stork in the sky knows her seasons, and the turtle dove and the swift and the crane keep the time of their migration, but my people do not know the legal judgment of Yahweh." So birds know when it's time to leave. Birds know, they basically follow God's orders by instinct, but these people are just oblivious that there is judgment coming upon them that they cannot see.
Yeah. And so the couple there, in the first instance, instead of "I've fallen and I can't get up," it's "I've fallen and I won't get up." And then he points to nature. Incidentally, just before the pointing to the birds, notice that he says, with regards to the people, everyone turned to his course like a horse charging into battle. So it's with determined purpose and eagerness, right? It's this vigorous notion. It's not just like they've slipped into it. No. I mean, they are sounding the charge, the horns into battle, into wickedness in this case. In pointing to the birds, this is interesting. So in this case, he says, you are not as wise as the birds, by way of illustration. They do what God says, you don't. But in other places, his comparison to animals is negative. And so what's the other comparison that he's been making to animal behavior and the people? Yeah. So on the one hand, it's you don't have the good sense to do what God has created you to do that even the birds have. But on the other hand, he says you don't have any more restraint than an animal. And so it's like they fail in both sides of the coin, right? They don't pay attention to God's natural order and obey him in that, but at the same time, they follow after their lust just like an animal in heat without any sort of higher end thinking and self-control. So I think that's interesting to note those good and bad comparisons, or they're unfavorably compared and then compared as in the animals are better than you. All right. Looking then, continuing on, so here's their rejection. And picking up in verse 8, Matt, what will the consequences of all of that rejection be?
Well, I think the first thing that will happen is when the armies finally show up outside the city, it says they'll be dismayed and they'll be caught. They'll be taken by surprise. In this passage, he's going to talk about the peace that they're preaching. I think last week we talked about the temple. They've taught this, they've believed this, so now when the enemy shows up, it's like, oh, well, what are we going to do? And then they're just going to be completely powerless in front of that enemy. They're going to be complete and total victims. It says their wives are going to be taken away and given to others. Their fields are going to be given to others to possess. Because they've rejected this wisdom, they don't know how to blush anymore. They don't know what's right and what's wrong. And because of that, they're just going to fall in great numbers. And that last verse there, 13 in particular, just that picture of something being utterly consumed. There's no more fruit on the vine. The leaves are drying up. That's just the end of it because they've chosen to reject this wisdom. Yeah.
I think we could sum it up by saying you're going to lose everything. And in so many ways, Jeremiah spells out what that means. You know, he articulates, just as Matt was pointing out here, in one instance and another. You're going to lose this, and you're going to lose this, and you're going to lose this. And so it's like, if there's any notion, well, maybe we'll hang on to this. No, he's going to address it before it's over and tell them they're going to lose that too. He makes sure they understand the totality of the devastation. Here is one of the sections where we see that repetition of their wives being given to their fields to new possessors, and with regards to the peace, but there is no peace. We've heard that. And the question, were they ashamed? They certainly were not ashamed. We saw that in our last class. And so he's coming back and he's throwing their words back in their face and throwing their attitudes back in their face over and over again, making clear the picture that all of this is a result of their own behavior, their own choices. And I think that is one of the major repeated themes throughout Jeremiah. Is not just that he tells them destruction's coming, but he constantly reminds them, this is your choice. This is what you've asked for. And time again, God has given you opportunities, and you would not have it. All right. Now, having said all of that, here is the destruction that's coming. It is the people's fault. It is their choice. And yet, what does their response seem to be, Chris?
Brad and Matt have mentioned, they're really still oblivious to really everything that's going on. They are realize something's going to happen, and well, we'll flee to the cities where protection is, and we're still not willing to turn fully to God. And there's many examples before when people, even at the very end, if you completely humble yourselves, it might give you some relief. They're not willing to do that, and instead they're going to be holed up in their cities, and it will be complete despair, and the terror is coming upon them.
Yeah, and they really seem to, at least in some ways, point the finger at God. He's given us poison water to drink. Look at, he's given up on us. Yeah, and so I guess in one sense they're not wrong. God is bringing the judgment. He is abandoning them. But it's in response to their abandonment of God, of course. This is not, this certainly isn't just coming out of the blue and can you believe God's given up on us? And Well, you ought to be able to believe it because it's been coming so long and that message has been being preached for quite some time. Well, he says, he concludes that section there in verse 17, behold, I am sending serpents against you, vipers for which there is no charm, they will bite you, declares Yahweh. I think there is a possible, we'll see serpents come up again. There's a possible reference here, thinking about Israel and their notions of relief coming. Where else have we seen vipers used as God's judgment?
Wandering in the wilderness.
Yeah, and there was a solution, wasn't there? Right? There was a way out. And I think in several instances, we're going to see God sending messages that he's bringing the same sort of judgment, only this time there is no way out. There's going to be no relief. There's going to be no, serpent that is a bronze serpent to look upon in order to find relief. It's just going to be the judgment that comes. Now, of course, I think that's figurative language as we see it connected back to the valiant steeds and so forth. Incidentally, verse 16, here's a place, just to point out, where geography is helpful. From Dan is heard the snorting of the horses. Where's Dan? It's the extreme north, right? So when we talk about Israel, it's from Dan, extreme north, to Beersheba, extreme south. Where's the enemy coming from? He's coming from the north, right? So that's why he points out from Dan the sounds are heard. Kevin? Right. So if you go back to the book of Joshua and you see where Dan ought to have been, it's kind of, I think, over towards the Mediterranean Sea, kind of midway. But in the book of Judges, of course, you see Danites wandering around looking for a place and basically looking for easy pickings. And that's why it seems that they end up in the north. So not only is it a reference to the north, yet it is yet another reference to failure in the tribes of Israel. All right. Picking up then in verse 18, we see a response, I think, from both Jeremiah, and tied into that is a response from God. What is Jeremiah's reaction to all of this, Sam?
Well, Jeremiah is mourning for his people because of the state of despair that he sees is on the horizon. And in verse 22, he says, there's no balm in Gilead, there's no physician there. Why then is there no recovery for the health of the daughter of my people? So there's no hope. All hope is gone. And then in chapter 9, he says, I wish that my head was water, my eyes a fountain of tears, that I might weep and for them day and night, for the slain of the daughters of my people, because of the destruction that he sees that's coming. And yet he knows that there's just not even a sufficient amount of tears that are possible for this whole situation. And then in verse 2, you don't have that listed there, but it seems like he's saying, oh, that I had a place in the wilderness. I would just leave my people and go.
Yeah.
It's a pretty gloom state of despair that even he sees because of what he knows is coming.
Yeah, and tied into that, again, I think we have God's weeping alongside. We start with the language there in 18 and then pick back up at least by chapter 9, verse 1, as Sam mentioned. But notice it says, the brokenness of the daughter of my people, for the brokenness of the daughter of my people, I am broken. I mourn. Desolation has taken hold of me. My people is possibly a reference to God joining in with him. Of course, it would not be completely inappropriate for Jeremiah to refer to them as my people. But we see that twice there, my people in verse 21, my people in verse 22. But at any rate, he's mourning this, and even in the midst of that mourning, he brings up the cry of the people. Harvest is past, summer is ended, and we are not saved. And Jeremiah's like, it's just a hopelessness, as Sam pointed out. Brad?
That is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? For whatever reason, it's bringing to mind when Edom, or Esau, after Jacob has cheated him out of his blessing, he said, is there no blessing left from thee, Father? Not anything? And of course, Isaac's only answer is, no, I gave him everything. You're going to be a slave. And so the utter despair there is just, Jeremiah knows, no, there's nothing. You people have inflicted upon yourselves a mortal wound by your sin.
Yeah, I think that's a good connection, that kind of desperate, surely there's something. And again, that we're back to the people think, in the people's mind, surely there's something that can be done. And it's the constant answer is, no, there's not. No, not anymore. There is no more balm. It's all used up. All right, Paul, as we continue on in beginning in verse 2 of chapter 9, he talks about the ignorance of this people, but he gives really, I think, a cause for that ignorance. Where does that come from?
So he's mentioned deceit a few times in the last chapter, but he really lays into it here. They're all adulterers, treacherous. They're using their tongue as a weapon. Don't trust your neighbor. Don't even trust your brother. Everyone's lying. And he connects that to this ignorance of God in verse 6, that through deceit they refuse to know me. So I'd call it a willful ignorance. They all speak lies, and so they don't know the truth.
Now, let me just go ahead and point forward here a little bit to a connection as the prophecy is made in chapter 31 that the Hebrew writer would reference in Hebrews chapter 8. What does Jeremiah prophesy in the restored kingdom is going to be the nature of the relationship with each man with his neighbor?
You won't have to teach your neighbor to know the Lord.
They will know the Lord. Here, not a single neighbor can be trusted. They all lie about the Lord. There, you won't have to tell your neighbor about the Lord because they all will, right? And so by the time we get to chapter 31, we see that several opposites will have been set up, right? So he's going to be laying the groundwork. This is the nature of my people. But in chapter 31, this will be the nature of my people. And it's going to be, in so many ways, the very opposite of what is being presented here throughout this section. Well, let me point out one thing there in that text that's interesting. He says, with regards to not trusting their neighbors, beware everyone, let everyone beware of his neighbor and do not trust his brother, because every brother surely supplants. Do you remember a name in the Bible that means supplants? Yeah, that's what this is. So every brother is surely Jacob. So they've gone backwards. You remember that sort of conversion story of Jacob, from Jacob to Israel. And there was meant to be a conversion, I think, of character from Jacob to Israel. They've gone back to being Jacob. They're deceivers, they're supplanters. They figure out how to do things on their own without God's help. And they're like Jacob, are going to find an end that they don't like in that if they don't return to God. So that's an interesting language connection there. All right, picking up in verse 7 then, God asks a couple of rhetorical questions there, Seth. What is his question in response to all this?
After talking about all their deceit and lies, he says, how shall I deal with my people? Shall I not punish them? Shall I not avenge myself on such a nation? Saying, I can't overlook this.
Yeah, so it puts the question in the lap of the reader as you're going through this, and maybe, especially if you're reading this after it's all been done, the setup has been laid out. And so now, people who might have cause to be upset with God, frustrated with God, here is God coming and saying, you tell me, what other options are on the table at this point? And the answer is, there is no other option. I mean, you're right. I was talking to a friend about going through withdrawal process at a congregation that just has not practiced that. And he's been preaching there for some time and talking with the elders, and they're ready to move forward. And he said, a lot of it came down to saying, what other options do we have? You know, and helping people get to the point of, if you don't think this is the right thing to do, you tell me what the next steps are. And there are no answers. And that is what we do when we've run out of answers, is this is the next step. This is the appropriate process. And so God's kind of putting it in the reader's lap. Brad?
We've seen this language before in Isaiah 5, when he talks about all the things he did for his vineyard.
Yes.
He cultivated, he poured everything he had into it, and it produces the very opposite of what he wanted. And so he told them then, this judgment is coming. So it's interesting to me to echo there.
Yeah, absolutely. And really, the justification, the self-justification of God throughout the prophets, which he is not bound to do, but he does it, I think, in large part, to build trust for the remainder, right? As we go back and we're reading that you learn about God, and you don't walk away in any way having any room for saying God is not just. I will go out of my way. I will pour pages and pages out to show you that I am more than just. I am merciful. And when my justice comes, it is at long last and after long suffering. Well, and so the judgment is coming. That's what he must do. And so Jeremiah looks forward to the completion of all of that. And what does he see, David?
I thought it was interesting in the King James Version in verse 11, he refers to the land as a den of dragons. So I kind of imagine an old war movie where the cities, the town, the fields have been blown to pieces, and there's nothing left. There's no life. It's just all ashes and dust and rubble. Everything's barren.
Yeah. So complete desolation. There's not even animals except for scavengers. Jackals is what most translations will say. Dragons, that's interesting. I didn't look at that one. I need to investigate that a little bit. But jackals is what most say. And so that's the picture of nobody's left but the ones who aren't there to inhabit, right? They're there to pick off what they can and move on. Nobody wants to live here anymore, not even the birds. And so smoking ruin is the idea. It looks like, war-torn. Okay. Yep.
One thing real quick, I thought it was interesting on that imagery of a den of jackals. Isaiah uses that to talk about Babylon in chapter 13, as well as in chapter 34. And so it's already language that is associated with, these essentially evil cities, evil nations, and destruction on them. And now it's coming on Judah as well.
Yes. And so think about that familiar language that you've heard applied to the nations over there, and now it's coming to you. And so that would be quite pointed to the Israelites. All right. Picking up then in verse 12, again, we come back and God gives the reason. And what reasons does he highlight here for all of this judgment, Garrett?
Well, like we've talked about a few times, they had forsaken his law that he had set before them. They had not obeyed his voice. And as their fathers had taught them, they went after the Baals.
Yes, yeah. And so it's interesting, again, people want to pick and choose what God judges nations for in the Old Testament. And it's gotten very popular for people to pick and choose the things that they also want to highlight as sins today. Social justice, as I've talked about, prophets are very popular for that. So they'll talk about the treatment of the poor and the treatment of the stranger and so forth. But I want to show you, I'm just going to keep highlighting. It's rooted in idolatry. It's rooted in a departure from God. And it is no good for us to sort of preach from the prophets that what God wants is generic kindness. He wants kindness that's rooted in who he is and his approach to people. He wants us to treat people like he treats people. And that's the very foundations. And if that's not, then your kindness ends up looking like the world's kindness, which let me tell you is pretty erratic. and not founded in any lasting foundation. And it's pointed very irregularly in different directions. Tony?
I mean, that's so true in all aspects of religion and of life. If your reasons for honesty are not based on your reason, or your relationship with God, then it goes nowhere. If your reason for loving your wife or your husband, being faithful to your wife or husband, are not based on your belief in God and faithfulness to Him, then it's kind of ephemeral. It can be
Shaky foundation.
yeah, shaky, and it's not based in anything. So we've got to have some strong standard and strong foundation to base everything on, and all the rest will naturally come and will not be based on something so flimsy.
Right. And notice too, as Garrett highlighted there, it's about obedience. It's about doing what God says. Sometimes you'll find people that'll pluck a passage from a prophet that talks in terms of concepts only. And obviously, those concepts are foundational, but they're intertwined with obedience. Whether it's faithfulness or justice or kindness or humility, whatever it is God's calling on His people, He's calling it through His law, through His commands. He's not saying, as long as you're nice, you don't have to do what I say. No, He says, you're not doing what I'm saying, and you're worshiping other gods. And then other places, He shows that's what's making you into terrible people. And if you would do what I say, then you would rise above all of that. So I think it's important for us to continue to notice what the foundations of their departure, what the foundations of their wickedness is, and what it is that God's calling them to do in order to repent. All right. Now, in a little bit of, I think, some sarcasm, who does He tell them they need to call for, John Michael?
He tells them to call for the mourning women, but then he says to send for the wailing women, and some versions say the skillful women. That seems to be the professional funeral singers who are adept at evoking the emotions. That's what he says in verse 18, that our eyes may shed tears and our eyelids flow with water. To really evoke the emotions there and help them understand kind of the situation they're in.
Yeah. So this is not something that we're very familiar with. I got to experience this at a Hindu funeral in Fiji. That in the middle, some way into the ceremony, a carload of women showed up, and they were mourning at moderate levels of volume, and they went into the house, and it was extraordinary, the sounds that came out of that house. And Marilyn, Navitash's little daughter, came running out, covering her ears and just looking at what is going on? And of course, Seth and I were kind of had the same looks on our face, But that's what they were. Navitash told us they had hired these women to come and mourn. And this is a fairly common historical practice in most cultures in history, and it's still going on today. It's just not something that we do. And it's very elaborate. And so you're basically hiring people to come paint the picture of your sorrow. I know that sounds strange, but that's what they're doing. And so Jeremiah says, go hire them. But I noticed one more thing in verse 20. Go teach your daughters, or teach their daughters, rather, to do this, or teach your daughters to do this. So I think the idea is you're not going to be able to hire enough of them. You're going to have to train more of them because you're going to run out, because there's going to be so many occasions and the mourning is going to be so great. And so that's the solution. And I think, from the standpoint of who do we call? Call the mourners. It's if you're thinking in terms of somebody that you love who's about to die, who can we call? Call the people to set up the funeral, right? Get the funeral prepared. That's the idea. All right. In verse 23, as you continue with this idea again of God's calling these people back, all of this judgment talk, and yet again and again, God extends a hand and makes a call. What does he want the people to delight in, Chase?
He first starts off by saying that he doesn't want the wise man to delight in his own wisdom, but that he wants his people to delight in that they know and understand who God is, and that he's the one true God, and that he's exercising his loving kindness, judgment, and righteousness in the earth.
Yeah. All right. So, so don't boast in the very things that people still boast in today, right? With riches and success and might, all the sorts of things that people might point to, and yet boast rather in knowing God, in having a humble relationship with God. And this, of course, is in contrast to the not knowing God and the deception that we talked about a few moments ago. This is an allusion to that picture of everyone will know me. Right? That's what he wants. That's the picture that he's painting for us here, the ideal picture that he's going to come back to. In verse 25, notice, behold, the days are coming, declares Yahweh, that I will punish all who are circumcised and yet uncircumcised. Some of your translations might say circumcised only in the flesh. I think this more literal translation is circumcised and yet uncircumcised. That is not language we're unfamiliar with. Where else do we hear kind of that conversation of circumcised yet not circumcised?
Paul's epistles.
Yeah, Paul uses it frequently, especially in Galatians and Romans. Brad?
The New King James renders it, punish all who are circumcised with the uncircumcised. And then, of course, he goes on to list those nations. But regardless, it's the idea that you think you're better off than those folks. No, you have put yourselves in with all those people whom you hate and whom you regard as the scum of the earth. You are the scum of the earth. I'm going to punish you along with
Yeah. And so one of the things that I think is very important to point out here is as we get into the New Testament and we see the references to circumcision, very often circumcision is pictured as this thing that the people put the wrong sort of emphasis on. And you could walk away with the notion that, as it turns out, circumcision never really was that important. That's not the point. The point is that circumcision was meant to be attached to something bigger. And circumcision by itself was never the point, but what circumcision represented. The physical circumcision was necessary, but to point to a greater thing, and God always wanted the circumcision of the heart. That's not a New Testament concept. That's always what God wanted from his people. We'll pick up there on number 18 on Wednesday. Thanks for your good attention.